When President Trump announced the reduction of staff at the Social Security Administration, SSA, Linda, a 50-year-old retail worker from Texas, had no idea how deeply this would affect her. After a long stretch of hard work in the retail industry, Linda was finally forced to take time off to recover from a serious health issue. It was the first time in years that she wasn't bringing in a paycheck. She had always been self-sufficient, but now she had to turn to SSA disability benefits to get by during her recovery. Linda assumed that the process of applying for benefits would be straightforward. After all, she had filled out the necessary paperwork months ago and was ready to start receiving her support. But what should have been a simple procedure turned into a long and exhausting waiting game. She'd submitted all the documents, followed the instructions to the letter, but now, the delay was unbearable. In the weeks following Trump's announcement of staff cuts, Linda started to notice something strange. The updates from SSA became scarce. Every time she checked her application status, all she saw was the dreaded message, "Under review." She tried calling the SSA helpline, but the lines were constantly busy. When she finally got through, the customer service agents were either too overwhelmed to give her any useful information or they simply said, "There's a delay due to staffing issues. Please be patient." But patience was running out. Her health was still a concern, and without her regular income, Linda was having trouble meeting even the basic needs of daily life: groceries, rent, and bills. Every day, she had to figure out how to stretch what little money she had, and the stress was beginning to take a toll. With every passing day, Linda's fear grew. The lack of income was taking a bigger bite out of her already stretched resources. The payments she had been promised from SSA, which were supposed to help her get by, remained unpaid. The constant calls to SSA went unanswered, or worse, she was given vague promises with no clear timelines. One particularly frustrating afternoon, Linda sat down to check her bank account, hoping for some kind of update. But as she scrolled through her transactions, she saw no new deposits. Her bank balance was running dangerously low. What was she supposed to do? Without the assistance she'd been promised, Linda was now faced with the grim reality that she was on her own. She needed her benefits, but the system was failing her. The delay wasn't just an inconvenience, it was turning into a crisis. She had no choice but to start borrowing money from friends and family, something she had never wanted to do. It was humiliating to ask for help, but she didn't have any other option. How much longer could she rely on others before it all fell apart? As Linda sat in her small apartment, waiting for the phone to ring or the mail to deliver some good news, she couldn't help but wonder how many others were going through the same thing. How many people were depending on SSA and getting caught in the same bureaucratic mess? She wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on. But one thing was certain, Linda wasn't going to wait quietly anymore. She had to do something. She wasn't going to let this go on indefinitely. After days of sitting and staring at her phone, Palmer knew it was time to take action. The waiting had become unbearable, and the frustration of not receiving any updates from SSA had been weighing on her. The mail had been empty, the phone calls to SSA had been ignored or met with vague promises, and her financial situation was getting worse by the day. She had no choice but to call again. The moment Palmer dialed the SSA customer service number, she felt a wave of frustration rise inside her. The long hold times, the endless waiting, and the broken promises were starting to feel like a game. As she sat on hold for what felt like an eternity, Palmer was gripped by the thought, how many others are out there going through the same thing? But today, she wasn't going to be passive. Today, she would get answers. Finally, after what felt like hours, a voice crackled through on the other end. "Thank you for calling SSA, how may I assist you today?" The voice was pleasant but robotic, just like every other time she had called. Palmer took a deep breath, her frustration boiling beneath the surface. "Hi, my name is Palmer, and I've been waiting for months for my disability benefits to be processed. I'm calling because I still haven't received any assistance, and no one can tell me what's going on. This is getting ridiculous." The customer service agent hesitated for a moment, probably taken aback by Palmer's directness. But Palmer didn't care. She was done with niceties. "I understand, Ms. Palmer. Unfortunately, we are experiencing delays due to reduced staff, the agent said. Your case is in the system, but there is a significant backlog. It will take some time to process. Palmer's heart sank. She had heard this same response a dozen times. The staff cuts were clearly taking a toll. But it didn't make it any easier to swallow. How much longer do I have to wait? Palmer asked, her voice sharper than before. I've been told that so many times already. I can't keep waiting like this. I'm struggling to pay my rent and buy food. How am I supposed to survive? The agent sighed, sounding genuinely sympathetic but helpless. I'm really sorry, Ms. Palmer. Unfortunately, there's nothing we can do to expedite the process. The backlog is affecting everyone, and we're working as quickly as possible. But I can't wait any longer. This is not acceptable. Palmer exploded, her anger and frustration rising to the surface. What do you mean you can't help me? This is my life. I'm not just a file number. I'm a person. There was a pause on the other end, and Palmer could practically hear the agent scrambling for words. But Palmer had already made up her mind. She wasn't going to wait anymore. What can I do to escalate this? I need this processed now. If I have to talk to someone higher up, I will. Palmer demanded. The agent hesitated but finally replied, I can escalate your case to a supervisor. However, I must warn you, it may still take time. Palmer knew this was her best shot. Please escalate it, she said, trying to calm herself down. I can't afford to wait. This is serious. The agent agreed to escalate the case and promised to have a supervisor call Palmer within the next 48 hours. Palmer felt a brief sense of victory, but the frustration didn't go away. She still had no idea how long it would take to get what she needed. As Palmer hung up the phone, she let out a deep breath. The phone call hadn't solved anything, but at least she had done something. At least she had taken control for a moment. She couldn't just sit back and wait anymore, she had to keep pushing. The morning after Palmer's phone call to SSA, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more she could do. The phone call had been unsatisfying, and while the promise of escalation gave her a small flicker of hope, she knew waiting for a supervisor to call wasn't enough. Her rent was due soon, her utilities were behind, and she couldn't keep borrowing money from friends and family. She needed to act faster, and she needed to act smart. That night, after dinner, Palmer sat down with her laptop, determined to find a way to get her voice out there. She wasn't going to be the only one who suffered in silence. She typed into her search bar, delays in SSA disability claims, and soon found a forum of people who were dealing with the same issue, hundreds of frustrated, struggling people who had been waiting far too long for their benefits. Palmer wasn't alone. Thousands of Americans were caught in the same bureaucratic nightmare. People were sharing their stories of delays, confusion, and the stress of not knowing when they would see any financial support. Many were disabled, just like Palmer, or were the elderly, relying on Social Security for basic living expenses. It seemed like everyone was facing the same frustrations. The comment sections were filled with angry remarks, promises to escalate cases, and some desperate pleas for help. Palmer realized that her story wasn't unique, it was part of a much larger issue. She quickly created an account on the forum and typed out a detailed post, outlining her experience with the SSA delays and the lack of action. She poured her frustration into the post, not holding back. I've been waiting for months. SSA promised they'd handle my case quickly, but instead, I'm drowning in bills. Why is no one helping? As Palmer clicked post, she felt a sense of relief. It wasn't much, but at least her story was now out in the open. But to her surprise, within minutes, she received notifications. People were liking her post. Then, there were comments, others who shared their experiences, others who were just as frustrated as she was. Some were even angry, saying they had been waiting longer than Palmer, or that they had been promised their benefits soon for over a year. The floodgates had opened, and Palmer could feel the collective energy building. Soon, more and more posts started flooding in. People were connecting, sharing phone numbers, and asking for advice on how to navigate the broken system. The momentum was undeniable. It wasn't just Palmer now. It was a movement. Palmer found herself replying to dozens of comments, offering advice, and supporting others who were also struggling. She had become a central figure in this growing community. Her post had sparked something bigger, something unexpected, but the real turning point came when one of the forum members sent Palmer a private message. It was from a woman named Sharon, who had been dealing with SSA for nearly 2 years. Sharon wrote, "This is bigger than us. We need to take this to the media. If we want to make a real difference, we need to bring attention to what's happening at SSA. Trust me, the media loves a good scandal." Palmer stared at the message for a moment, considering it. Sharon was right. It wasn't just about her anymore, it was about everyone who had been left in limbo by SSA's inefficiency. Palmer had started a ripple, but this could turn into a wave. She immediately replied, "Let's do it." Her story was not just her own anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been waiting, frustrated, and forgotten. As Palmer sat back in her chair, the reality hit her. She was no longer just a woman fighting for her disability benefits. She was a catalyst. She was part of something that could change things. Not just for her, but for everyone. The battle wasn't over yet, but Palmer knew one thing: she wasn't going to be silenced. The next day, Palmer woke up feeling more frustrated than ever. It had been days since her last call to SSA, and still, there had been no progress. She couldn't sit around any longer, just waiting for someone to help her. The clock was ticking, and the mounting pressure of unpaid bills, overdue rent, and the constant uncertainty was starting to wear her down. Palmer had always been someone who could take matters into her own hands, but now she was feeling helpless. SSA's inaction was crippling her, and she wasn't going to just wait for a supervisor's call to fix it. It was time to act, time to make some noise. That evening, Palmer opened up her laptop, determined to get her frustration heard. She had read stories online of others who were facing the same problems: long delays, unprocessed claims, and the same endless bureaucratic circle that left people stuck. After everything she'd been through, Palmer knew there had to be others out there who felt just as helpless. She had seen forums and community pages dedicated to people struggling with SSA delays. So, she decided to post on one of them. It was time for her story to be told. With a deep breath, she began typing, "I've been waiting for my disability claim to be processed for months. I can't get a clear answer from anyone. The phone lines are always busy, and I get the same excuses: staff shortage, backlog. Please be patient. How long is it going to take before someone actually takes action? This is not just an inconvenience, this is ruining my life. I can't afford rent, I'm falling behind on bills, and I've already had to borrow money just to get by. This is unacceptable." She clicked post and waited. Nothing happened at first. The screen stared back at her, offering no response. Palmer sighed and began scrolling through other posts on the forum, waiting for something, anything. Then, a notification popped up. Her post had been liked, then shared. More people were commenting, and Palmer's heart began to race. Was this actually happening? The comments started pouring in. Some were sympathetic, some angry, all sharing the same sentiment: we're in this together. Many shared their own stories, and Palmer quickly realized how widespread the issue was. She wasn't alone. In fact, her story was just one of hundreds, if not thousands, of people stuck in the same situation. She kept scrolling, reading story after story about people who had submitted their claims months ago, but were still getting nothing. One user wrote, "I filed my claim over a year ago, still no updates. No word. Meanwhile, I can barely afford rent. This is insane." Another post read, "Same here. They said I'd get my benefits in 2 weeks. It's been 6 months." Palmer's anger flared. It wasn't just her, the entire system was broken, but what happened next took Palmer completely by surprise. As she kept refreshing her post, a private message from one of the forum members popped up. It was from Sharon, a woman who had been struggling with SSA delays for over 2 years. "You're not alone in this. I've been fighting SSA for years. Trust me, we need to take this to the media. If we want to make a real difference, we need more eyes on this. People need to know how bad it really is." The message hit Palmer like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just about her anymore, this was a nationwide issue, and it was time to escalate. Palmer quickly typed back, "How do we do it?" Sharon replied almost instantly, "Start by contacting the news stations. Share your story. Let people know how long you've been waiting and how this is affecting your life. Trust me, the media loves a scandal, and they'll pick this up." Palmer sat back in her chair, her mind racing. How did she not think of this sooner? She could feel a surge of adrenaline rush through her veins. She wasn't going to wait for SSA or a supervisor. She was going to make sure people knew what was happening. The idea of contacting the news felt like a new beginning, a turning point in her fight. Her voice wasn't just for her anymore, it was for everyone else who had been ignored, left to struggle in silence. This was bigger than just her claim. Without wasting another second, Palmer began drafting a powerful email to the local news station. She included her story, the stories from the forum, and the overwhelming number of people who were facing the same struggles with SSA. She didn't just want to raise awareness, she wanted action. She needed the news station to see how systemic the issue was, how deeply it affected people, and how incompetent the system had become. Once she hit send, Palmer felt a weight lift off her shoulders. The feeling of empowerment she hadn't felt in months was starting to settle in. This was just the beginning. The next morning, Palmer received a response from the news station. The investigative team had read her email and wanted to interview her. The story was going public, she could hardly believe it. Palmer was no longer a passive victim. She had become the voice of the millions who had been forgotten. Palmer had barely slept the night after sending that email. The excitement, and the nervous anticipation, kept her tossing and turning in bed. Would the media respond? Would they take her seriously? She couldn't shake the feeling that her entire life was about to change. What started as a personal battle for disability benefits had turned into something much larger, a public fight for fairness in the system. And now, it was time to see if her voice would make an impact. The next morning, her phone buzzed while she was making her coffee. She nearly dropped her mug as she fumbled to answer it. It was the news station. "Hi, Palmer. This is Jessica Reynolds from KTX News. We received your email, and we're very interested in your story. We'd like to set up an interview." Palmer's heart skipped a beat. She had done it. She had taken the plunge and it was paying off. She wasn't just a frustrated individual anymore, she was part of a story that could shed light on something much bigger. Something that needed to be fixed, of course, yes. "I'm ready to share everything. Thank you so much for reaching out," Palmer replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Inside, she was thrilled, but she had to stay composed. This was her moment. The interview was set for the next afternoon. The hours leading up to it were filled with nervous energy. Palmer didn't know what to expect, but she knew one thing: this was her chance to make a real difference. When Jessica Reynolds and the cameraman arrived, Palmer tried to stay calm. She had seen interviews on TV before, but this was real life. This was her story, and she was going to make sure everyone knew how flawed the system was. Jessica smiled and introduced herself as they set up the camera. "Palmer, we're really grateful that you reached out to us. We've been following stories like yours, but yours really stands out. How long have you been waiting for your benefits to be processed?" Palmer took a deep breath and began. "It's been nearly 6 months now, and each time I call, I hear the same thing: we're understaffed, we're backlogged, or your case is under review. I'm just one of many. The whole system is broken. I'm struggling to pay my bills, I'm behind on my rent, and I'm doing everything I can just to survive." The words flowed out of Palmer like a dam breaking. She wasn't just recounting her personal story anymore, she was speaking for thousands of others who felt ignored, invisible, and helpless. She explained how the SSA's inefficiency had affected her life, making it harder to pay for her medications, food, and basic necessities. She even mentioned the emotional toll, how the stress of it all had begun to affect her health. As Palmer spoke, she could feel the cameras capturing her every word, but she didn't care anymore. She was done with silence. She was done with waiting. Now, the world was listening. Jessica nodded along and asked a few follow-up questions, but the interview felt like a conversation between two people who understood each other. Palmer didn't need to explain the system to Jessica, she got it. And that made Palmer feel like maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. As the camera crew packed up, Jessica smiled at Palmer. "You're doing something really important here. We'll make sure people hear your story. It's time to shed light on what's happening at SSA." Palmer walked them out of her apartment, and as she closed the door behind her, a sense of calm washed over her. For the first time in months, she felt like she had control over something. She had taken a step, not just for herself, but for everyone struggling with the same issue. It wasn't just about waiting anymore. Now, she was a part of something bigger. And it felt good to know that her voice had been heard, but Palmer knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The day after Palmer's interview aired, everything changed. It was as if the floodgates had opened. Her phone buzzed constantly, each notification pulling her deeper into the growing storm. Messages of support, comments from strangers, and stories of others who had been through the same agonizing delays flooded her inbox. It was a wave of emotion and relief. People were finally hearing her. More importantly, they were sharing their own struggles, confirming Palmer's suspicion that this wasn't just an isolated issue. By noon, Palmer had already received multiple calls from news outlets wanting to cover the story further. She was interviewed by a second reporter, this time from a larger media network that reached across the state. "How does it feel to know that your story is getting so much attention?" the reporter asked. "It feels like I'm not alone anymore," Palmer answered. "I've been fighting for so long, and now, other people are standing beside me. Together, we're stronger." It was clear that Palmer's situation was no longer just hers. Her story had gained momentum, and now she was at the center of a movement that had taken root, reaching far beyond her small apartment. The SSA delays were suddenly a national conversation. People were speaking out, and lawmakers were feeling the pressure to act, but Palmer knew that the battle wasn't over. While the media attention was a huge victory, it was only the beginning. There were still real, practical issues to address, like how many others were still stuck in the same bureaucratic nightmare. How many families were barely scraping by, waiting for the support they were promised. She started to receive more personal messages, people telling her about the challenges they faced in their own claims. Some were homeless. Others were on the brink of losing their homes because they hadn't received the payments they were entitled to. For the first time, Palmer felt the weight of her role. She wasn't just an individual anymore, she had become the voice of a community. Palmer was asked to speak at a rally organized by a local advocacy group that aimed to hold SSA accountable for the delays. The rally was set to take place the following weekend, and Palmer agreed. "It's time to take this to the streets," she thought. She had been quiet for far too long. But now, people were listening. And it was time to demand change. Saturday morning arrived, and Palmer stood in front of a small crowd of people gathered outside the SSA office in downtown. She could see the faces of men and women who, like her, were exhausted and frustrated. Some were holding signs that read "Stop the delays," while others simply stood silently, waiting for Palmer to speak. It wasn't a huge crowd, but Palmer knew that this was just the beginning. She stepped up to the microphone, her heart racing, but her voice clear. "I'm standing here today because I'm tired of waiting," Palmer began, her voice echoing through the speakers. "We've all been waiting for too long. The system promised us help. But we've been left in the dark. Our lives are on hold, and we're done with it. We're here today to demand accountability. We want action, not empty promises." The crowd cheered. Palmer felt a rush of emotion. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been ignored and abandoned by a system that had failed them. Palmer's speech was powerful, her words resonating with the crowd. As she spoke, she could feel the strength of the movement she had helped spark. It was no longer about one person's struggle, it was about thousands of individuals who had been silenced for too long. And now, they were demanding to be heard. As the rally came to a close, a local news station showed up to interview Palmer and other members of the rally. The cameras filmed the crowd and captured the growing anger at SSA's inefficiencies. Palmer knew that this was only the beginning. Change was coming. It wouldn't happen overnight, but the rally was a huge step forward in building the momentum that could eventually lead to real reform. The media coverage from the rally was everywhere. News stations, social media, and even local radio stations picked up Palmer's story. It felt surreal, and yet, Palmer couldn't ignore the buzzing anxiety that came with being in the public eye. She had never imagined that a simple struggle for disability benefits would lead to this much attention. But now, it was clear, this wasn't just about her. This was a fight for everyone who had been ignored by the system, but as the days went by, the initial excitement began to fade. The calls from journalists stopped, and the cameras stopped rolling. Palmer's inbox was still full of messages from people sharing their own struggles, but despite all the attention, nothing had changed in her case. She hadn't received any updates from SSA, and the waiting continued. Palmer was growing increasingly frustrated. The media's attention had been amazing, she was grateful for the increased awareness, but now she was faced with a difficult truth: public attention alone wasn't enough. She had to keep pushing. On a Thursday morning, after another sleepless night, Palmer received an unexpected phone call. It was from Sharon, the woman who had suggested taking the issue to the media in the first place. Sharon's voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable urgency in it. "Palmer, we need to meet. There's something going on." Palmer felt her heart race. "What's happening?" she asked. "There's a rumor going around," Sharon said, her voice dropping lower. "I've been hearing things from other people in the system. There's a major pushback happening at SSA. They're trying to silence the voices of people like us. They're trying to make the entire situation go away, hoping we'll all give up." Palmer sat up straight, the words sinking into her mind like stones. "What do you mean?" "I don't have all the details, but it's becoming clear that someone on the inside doesn't want this to get worse," Sharon continued. "There are efforts to sweep this under the rug, Palmer. If we don't keep the pressure on, we might lose everything we've gained." Palmer's mind spun. They couldn't just let this go. Everything they had worked for, the media coverage, the rally, the momentum, was at risk. She was no longer just fighting for herself, she was fighting for everyone who had spoken up and shared their stories. She wasn't going to let them silence this movement. Palmer knew what she had to do. It was time to take it a step further. That afternoon, Palmer sat down at her desk, staring at the blank screen of her laptop. It was time to turn up the heat. She had a new idea, one that would make sure the voices of the people stuck in SSA's limbo would not be ignored. She was going to expose the systemic issues in a way that SSA couldn't escape. Palmer began to craft an open letter, a bold, direct statement to both SSA and the public. She wasn't going to just talk about her struggles anymore. She was going to call out the failures of the system, and she was going to do it publicly. The letter would highlight the lack of accountability at SSA and the real consequences for people who were waiting for their benefits. She didn't hold back. This was her fight for justice, and it was time to expose the truth. The letter was long, but it was a clear call to action. Palmer shared how SSA's incompetence was affecting real people, people like her, and how the lack of action was leading to serious consequences. She described the emotional, physical, and financial toll that the delays were causing for thousands of families. She wasn't asking for sympathy, she was demanding change. Once the letter was ready, Palmer didn't hesitate. She sent it to every local news outlet, every reporter she had spoken to before, and shared it on social media with the hashtag #SSA accountability. She even sent it to the White House, making sure that her message was heard by the highest levels of government. Palmer wasn't just going to wait for SSA to respond, she was forcing their hand. The very next day, Palmer received a response from a news anchor she hadn't spoken to yet. The anchor's message was short but clear: "We're running your letter on the evening news. You've made a strong point, and we need to bring this issue into the spotlight again." Palmer could feel the anticipation rising. She had done it. The media was picking up the letter, and soon the entire city would be talking about the injustice that so many people had been facing with SSA. Then, that evening, Palmer turned on her TV to see her open letter broadcasted across the screen. The anchor read it aloud, carefully emphasizing the key points Palmer had made: the broken promises, the lack of communication, and the human cost of SSA's inefficiency. It was a powerful moment. Her words were now being heard by thousands. The impact was immediate. More people started to come forward, sharing their own stories and rallying behind Palmer's cause. The social media movement exploded, and news outlets began to cover the issue more frequently. It seemed like Palmer had done it. She had finally broken through the wall of bureaucracy and forced the issue into the open. Palmer's phone hadn't stopped ringing since the night her letter was aired on the news. Messages of support flooded in from all directions, from friends, strangers, and even some politicians who had heard her story. The overwhelming response was both heartening and a reminder of the magnitude of the battle she had set in motion. However, despite the media attention and the massive outpouring of public support, Palmer knew that this wasn't the end. Her heart ached for the thousands who were still waiting, still stuck in the same bureaucratic mess that had trapped her for months. The momentum was real, but she couldn't let it fizzle out. Change had to happen. It was a Thursday afternoon when Palmer got the email she'd been both hoping for and dreading. The subject line read, "Response from SSA." She clicked it open, almost afraid to read what was inside. For the first time in months, she felt like everything was riding on this one message. The email was a generic response, apologizing for the delays but offering little in the way of real solutions. It promised that SSA was working on improvements and that future delays would be minimized. It was a standard bureaucratic response, empty words and no real change. Her heart sank as she read it. Was this all they had to say after everything? Palmer stared at the screen in disbelief. This wasn't what she had fought for. She wasn't interested in empty promises or band-aid solutions. The fight wasn't over. If anything, it had just begun. As she sat there, stewing in frustration, her phone rang again. It was a number she didn't recognize. "Hello." She answered, her voice barely containing her irritation. "Hi, Palmer. This is Senator Langston's office. I'm calling because your story has made quite an impact. We've been working on a bill to address the backlog at SSA, and we'd like you to speak at a hearing next week." Palmer's breath caught in her throat. This was it. This was the breakthrough she had been waiting for. She'd been fighting for weeks, and now it felt like her hard work was finally paying off. She was going to take this all the way to the top. The hearing was a golden opportunity to push for real reform. "Of course, I'll be there," Palmer said, her voice steady. "Thank you so much for reaching out." She hung up the phone, her mind racing. She had done it, her voice was being heard. And now she had the chance to make a difference for everyone. The days leading up to the hearing were a blur. Palmer was inundated with interviews, and she spent hours preparing her testimony. She wrote out every detail of her experience: the waiting, the frustration, the human cost of SSA's inefficiency. But she knew she couldn't just speak for herself. She had to speak for everyone who had been forgotten by the system. The people who were still waiting. The ones who hadn't had a chance to raise their voice yet. The day of the hearing arrived, and Palmer was ready. She walked into the Senate hearing room, where she was greeted by rows of lawmakers and a crowd of advocates. The room was packed, the air thick with anticipation. She felt the weight of the moment, but she also felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. when it was her turn to speak, Palmer walked up to the microphone. The cameras flashed, and she felt the eyes of the entire room on her. She looked at the panel of senators sitting before her and took a deep breath. "I stand here today not just for myself," Palmer began, her voice steady. "I stand here for the thousands of Americans who have been left in the dark by a broken system. For the ones who are still waiting, still suffering, and still hoping for the help they were promised. We are not numbers on a spreadsheet. We are people, and we deserve to be treated with respect." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I've been waiting for months, for what was promised to me. And during that time, I've been forced to make impossible decisions. How to pay my rent. How to feed myself. How to make sure I don't fall further into debt. But I know I'm not the only one. There are thousands of people just like me. People who are depending on this system, and yet we're being left behind. This is not acceptable." Palmer's heart was pounding in her chest, but she could feel the room shift. She wasn't just another person complaining. She was speaking truth, and people were listening. "I ask you today," Palmer continued, her voice growing stronger, "to listen to our stories. To hear the real consequences of these delays. And most importantly, I ask you to make this right. Fix the system so people like me, people who need this help the most, aren't left struggling in the dark."